Time has expired. Recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that this is the last meeting of this task force. Is that correct? It's my understanding this is the last meeting of this task force?
Yes, it is.
And that's a shame, because I think that this task force, with you, Mr. Chairman, and with the help of the ranking member, have done a very diligent job objectively identifying some of the greatest threats that we see today in terrorism financing. And I would implore Chairman Henseling to do more to keep this task force going, because what we've learned, I think, in the brief period that this task force has been around, it is undisputed that Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism, and that despite ongoing sanctions, they continue to finance terrorism activity throughout the world, that they are led by extremist clerics who are committed to the destruction of Israel and Iran, and that if this Iranian deal goes through and the relief of at least $100 billion in sanctions will flow more money to terrorist groups throughout the world and make this world even less safe. Ms. Rosenberg, you speak of allowing for other opportunities, if you will, when we're in an engagement of usual and customary financial transactions through the infrastructure of the financial services arena. For example, continued stronger anti-money laundering, increased sanctions. Those sound good. How do we go about implementing that? In other words, we're about ready to probably see the release of sanctions against what has been deemed to be the central bank of terrorism, Iran, and yet we know that we have to do something so long as they're within the infrastructure, if you will, of financial services, and those would include further sanctions. What would you propose?
Thank you for the question. In order to counter the threat that Iran poses to our financial system and indeed to our national interests as a state sponsor of terror, there are a number of things that we can do from a policy and regulatory perspective to address this. One is the modification of the 311 on Iran that I mentioned previously. Additionally, I would suggest doubling down on sanctions targeting the IRGC and its links to terrorism. So, though many sanctions, including all of the most significant economically punishing ones on Iran, will be lifted on implementation day under this deal, assuming that takes place, sanctions on IRGC and those that are imposed under terrorism authorities are not going to be lifted, and secondary penalties will still be associated with them.
And that has proven to be very effective, too.
Yes.
So, sanctions.
I agree. It seems that way to me, at a minimum, from the perspective of identifying, naming, and shaming entities associated with that and arresting their ability to use the financial system. So,
thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Modell, real quickly, I know that you've, and I'll have you address that as well, but I think you hit a point that I think is very important that we have to realize, and that for those terrorist organizations out there that avail themselves to what we consider to be traditional terrorist means, which don't use the infrastructure of the financial services arena, that brute force is an element. And is it not an element that we have to consider as one of the tools if we're going to successfully combat the financing of terrorism throughout this world?
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, in a place like Syria, based on the stories that I've heard, trying to compel truck drivers to abide by the laws, try to create greater border security, all those things I think will eventually have to happen, and we have to focus on that in the next phase. I think now, unfortunately, there has to be smart, designated kinetic activity, at least freeing ourselves up to do that.
And I think we have to realize that as an essential tool in our toolbox in order to combat this. Real quickly, yesterday 15 governors, one of which is my governor from the great state of Florida, sent a letter to the President essentially saying that the deal, with the Iranian deal, highlights concerns that lifting federal sanctions will only result in Iran having more money available to fund terrorism. They quote Acting Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Crimes as saying that he expects to continue to see Iran funding Hezbollah and its other violent terrorist proxies. The states do have sanctions. These states do have sanctions against Iran. They don't want to be forced into, because this has been deemed not to be a treaty, and therefore state law preempts right here, and they're not required to lift their sanctions. My concern is that if these 15 states don't lift their sanctions, which I support them not doing, are we going to see Iran then look at this deal and say, U.S., you're in violation of this deal because you haven't lifted all sanctions? Is that a viable consequence, which then could lead to Iran saying, look, you breached the deal, U.S., all bets are off, It doesn't matter what you've done with the sanctions because you've lifted them, but we're going to go forward with what we want to do. Mr. Modell, I'll start with you.
There's two things I would consider. One is that I think the #1 goal of the Iranians in the removal of sanctions and pressure and the normalization of the nuclear program was to restore trade relations normal trade relations with Asia and Europe. America would be a bonus potentially down the road, but if U.S. states start causing problems, keep sanctions on, start changing the fabric of the deal to some degree, or at least the spirit of the deal, I don't think it'll have an impact, to be honest with you. But let me just go back real quick to what you were saying before. I think in terms of one of the things we could do as Iran comes back into the financial system is expose the fact that they don't have a financial intelligence unit. They don't report suspicious transactions. They don't abide by FATF regulations. They're large state-run charitable foundations which control billions and billions of dollars, aren't reportable to any authority whatsoever, and have long been linked to terrorism. So an exposure of that in the media, in a positive media campaign for education, transparency would go a long way.
Thank you. And I see my time's expired, though, Mr. Shirley. Thank you.
Chair